Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. Good morning. It's Tuesday, the 21st of October. I'm Caroline Hepker in London.
And I'm Stephen Carroll in Brussels. Coming up today, Donald Trump casts doubt on Ukraine's ability to defeat Russia as the US and EU take different paths on sanctioning Moscow.
The United States signs a deal with Australia for access to rare earths and other minerals as Washington tries to counter China's grip on key raw materials.
Plus, after 15 hours of global internet disruption, Amazon Web Services says it's fixed the issue that plagued its cloud customers.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
US President Donald Trump has cast doubt on Ukraine's ability to defeat Russian forces, marking a dramatic shift from his view that the country could reclaim all of its territory. The change in position comes as Trump prepares for a second summit with Vladimir Putin in Budapest. Speaking to reporters in the White House, Trump said he was unsure how the war would play out.
They could still win it. I don't think they will, but they could still win it. I never said they would win it. I said they could win. Anything can happen. You know, war is a very strange thing. A lot of bad things happen, a lot of good things happen.
The US President has repeatedly changed his assessment of Ukraine's prospects and the extent of his support for the country's President, Volodymyr Zelensky. Last month, Trump said that Ukraine was, quote, in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. Meanwhile, the US Senate will hold off considering new sanctions on Russia until after Trump's meeting with Putin. It's a sign of further divergence with European leaders who are expected to adopt a fresh Russia sanctions package this week. The EU's Foreign Affairs Chief Kaja Kallas says Ukraine must negotiate an end to the war from a position of strength.
Ukraine has been ready for unconditional ceasefire already since February, but Russia has no genuine interest in peace. We all support President Trump's efforts to end the war, but Putin will only negotiate seriously if he thinks he's losing.
That's the EU's Kaja Kallas speaking. Now, Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky has said he'd consider an invitation to Budapest. EU foreign ministers have criticised the choice of venue. France's foreign minister saying the presence of Vladimir Putin on EU soil only makes sense if it allows for an immediate ceasefire without conditions.
The UK is preparing to send well over £100 million to send its forces into Ukraine if a ceasefire agreement with Russia is reached. It comes as Britain and other European allies are planning to station troops in Ukraine after a peace deal is signed, but away from front lines. The UK's Defence Secretary John Healey says that the cost would cover the initial outlay for troops as well as aircraft for a stabilization force. It's separate from the £4.5 billion already promised by the government. Healey also announced that the UK is drawing up new legal powers to shoot down drones over military bases. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, meanwhile, will attend talks of the so-called Coalition of the Willing in London on Friday after European leaders hold a summit in Brussels on Thursday.
The United States and Australia have signed a pact to increase America's access to rare earths and other critical minerals in a deal to counter China's control over supply chains. Shares of critical mineral producers have jumped in Sydney after President Trump signed the agreement with Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese in Washington. Here is Australia's Treasurer Jim Chalmers speaking to Bloomberg after the deal was signed.
And what that's all about is about helping to ensure Australia becomes a world leader in the export of rare earths and critical minerals. It's all about making sure that we strengthen our trade ties with the US, that we strengthen supply chains, and that we make sure that this remarkable opportunity that Australia has with rare earths and critical minerals is properly maximised.
The deal will begin with the US and Australia each paying more than $1 billion over the next 6 months for initial projects. Meanwhile, President Trump also declared full steam ahead for the AUKUS Security Pact, a defence deal signed by the US, UK and Australia in 2021, designed to counter China's military expansion in the Indo-Pacific region.
Now, Sanae Takaichi has become Japan's first female Prime Minister after winning a vote in the lower house of Parliament. She's now preparing to form her cabinet, which is expected to be announced later today. Takaichi faces an immediate diplomatic test with a possible visit to Japan by US President Donald Trump next week. At home, the challenge will be to revive her ruling LDP's fading popularity and ease public anger over the rising cost of living.
Amazon Web Services, the world's largest cloud provider, said its operations have returned to normal after an internet outage disrupted many of the world's biggest websites and apps. It follows a 15-hour blackout that hit customers across the globe, from government agencies to financial platforms. The episode highlighted how much of the internet is dependent on the operations of a single company. Bloomberg's Sarah Fryer spoke after operations were restored.
They have a third of the cloud computing market. A large number of services are entirely reliant on that being operational. It really is noticed, and it's simultaneously a moment to recognize how powerful this company has become and how vulnerable these services are to its disruption.
AWS blamed the outage on a malfunction in a key database system that caused failures across its data centres on the US East Coast, the company's largest hub.
Shares in French bank BNP Paribas plummeted by almost 8% after a US court ruling linked it to human rights abuses in Sudan. The ruling has triggered speculation that the lender will ultimately have to pay billions of dollars to settle related cases. On Friday, a jury in Manhattan found the bank liable for its role in enabling genocide in Sudan and awarded about $21 million to 3 plaintiffs. That's seen as opening the door to potentially thousands of other claims. In a statement, BNP Paribas denied it's under pressure to settle and says that it intends to appeal the ruling, which it says, quote, ignores important evidence the bank was not permitted to introduce. So those are some of our top stories for you this morning. In terms of the markets this Tuesday, we do have a global stock rally, although stock futures for the US and Europe a bit mixed. US Stocks 50 futures up by about 0.1%. What we are seeing is a big jump in Japanese stocks, adding to record highs. The Nikkei 225 up 0.7%, close to 50,000, so edging towards that. Earnings are in focus today in the US. Gold yesterday climbed 2.5%. This morning taking something of a breather, but we're still near record highs. Rare earth companies in Australia jumping after that US-Aussie deal. 10-year Treasury yields this morning below 4%. We have falling oil prices easing concerns about inflation. 10-year Treasury yields this morning trading at 3.98. Those are the markets.
Well, in a moment, we'll bring you more on Donald Trump's latest comments on Ukraine, plus details of the critical minerals deal between the US and Australia. But another story that we've been reading this morning about the Louvre raid, just 7 minutes to steal those precious jewels from the French museum. But it's actually the third heist from a French museum this year, our opinion columnist Lionel Laurent writes. And actually, it's an indication of a broader trend, essentially, because we're more cashless. There are fewer banks to rob or registers to empty. So Lionel argues that, in fact, instead, thieves are turning to gold or other precious materials to try and raise cash, essentially. And, you know, it raises a whole load of questions, of course, about the security, particularly of French museums, given that there have been 3 in the past month, although he points out that there have been other thefts as well from the likes of the Drents Museum in the Netherlands, and even going back a couple of years, the British Museum too. But there, you know, this is something that could be a new trend in crime.
Yeah. The awful thing, though, of course, is that these museums are the embodiment of soft power, of history and culture that Europe prides itself on, you know, sells itself as a tourist destination for. So I think, yes, there are fingers being pointed in terms of the security, real worries about what that means for other museums. And also that Lionel says museums are going to have to be much more careful about how they kind of crudely might be luring visitors with the value of their exhibits. I mean, look, the Tower of London, are they stepping up security? I mean, this is
famously well guarded.
Yeah, my speculation, but you know, obviously that with the jewels there. But I do think the cashless society point is fascinating, that banks don't hold as much in their vaults, so maybe these crooks are looking elsewhere.
More danger money for the beefeaters in the Tower of London, maybe, given in these difficult times for museums. Anyway, you can read the full piece, bloomberg.com/opinion, and we will put a link to it in our podcast show notes. Let's bring you more now on our top story on Ukraine. Whether or not the country accepts Donald Trump's peacemaking, it may be at risk from the US president's changing stance on the war. Tony Halpin, who leads our team covering Russia, joins us now for more. Tony, this is another shift in position from Donald Trump on Ukraine. It seems to have reverted. Is this pressure on Ukraine rather than on Vladimir Putin?
Yes, good morning. I mean, this seems to be one of the difficulties in the transactional approach that President Trump has to this war. For Ukraine and Europeans, it means that he's constantly switching positions. And he currently seems to be in a position where he's not actually providing much in the way of military aid to Ukraine, and at the same time not putting much pressure, or indeed any pressure, on Vladimir Putin to come to the table to negotiate. So the leverage points seem unclear to Ukraine and to Europe, and that just leaves Putin in many ways free to continue to conduct his war, and he has shown no inclination to do otherwise.
Yeah, and so also, of course, there will be potentially in the next few weeks a second summit, and Vladimir Putin on European soil, which has caused a lot of pushback. I mean, in terms of the peace, getting to peace, Bloomberg's Mark Champion, in his opinion column today, which I think is fascinating, calls it Putin's poison pill deal. President Trump pushing Ukraine to cede about 30% of the Donetsk province, which is a huge kind of swathe of land, and that is very strategically crucial to Ukraine and actually to Europe. Can you explain that? That's the extraordinary point here.
Yes, and that's the reason Ukraine is very unwilling to even contemplate this idea of giving up Donetsk. Donetsk is a fortified area of eastern Ukraine. There are cities there which Ukraine has fortified and held onto throughout this war, and ceding that territory would effectively be handing over those fortified areas to Putin on a plate. And that opens up then other areas of Ukraine which are much less well defended and fortified. So the argument from Kiev all along is that this leaves us vulnerable to Putin coming back later, once he's reinvigorated his army, to starting again a war that we are finding it then much more difficult to defend, and he will be able to make more progress and take more territory in Ukraine, and that clearly is against our national interests. And as Mark points out in his very interesting piece, Putin is asking for 2/3 of the territory that he has managed to take in more than 3 years of war and at the cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. So it's no small ask, and he's well aware of that.
What can the Europeans do now? There are meetings this Thursday and Friday in Brussels and in London, the European Council and the Coalition of the Willing. They'll be talking about sanctions and other divergence in position from the US, and also this issue of using frozen Russian assets.
Yes, I think the Europeans are somewhat in despair, because first they need to figure out how to influence the meeting if it takes place between Presidents Trump and Putin in Budapest. Viktor Orban is not Brussels' favourite leader in the European Union. He's viewed as a much more Russia-friendly leader. He will host these talks, and Ukraine's allies are still trying to work out how they can get some influence at that meeting in order to divert President Trump away from giving things that might be too damaging for Ukraine. That leaves them with things like sanctions, with things like trying to use the frozen assets to buy more weapons and bolster Ukraine. But they're pretty gloomy as things stand at the moment.
Okay. Tony, thank you so much for being with us this morning and discussing the latest when it comes to Ukraine. Tony Halpin leads Bloomberg's team covering Russia. Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe coming up after this.
The United States and Australia have agreed a deal to boost America's access to rare earths, an effort to counter China's grip on the supply chains of key metals. Our metals and minings reporter, Paul Allen-Hunt, joins us now for more. Great to have you with us. Talk us through, first of all, what's in this deal between the US and Australia?
Well, I guess at the heart of it, for the last decade, the West has really sat on its hands when it came to building out capacity in rare earths and other critical minerals. So now China has between an 80 to 90% share of the supply chain. So in some instances, it's even as high as 99%. So, of course, that's been a huge concern for the US. Overnight, they announced that they'd spend $1 billion each. That's the Australian and the US government, $1 billion each on critical minerals projects. There's been 2 rare earth companies that inked non-binding agreements for hundreds of millions of dollars, Arafura Rare Earths and Northern Minerals. Minerals Limited. Global aluminium giant Alcoa also announced it would receive funds to process something called gallium at its Australian refineries. And also in there, Trafigura's Australian arm Neostar to produce a metal that isn't often talked about called antimony, one of those minor metals that we never really hear about. All of this is to challenge China's dominance, which really has the US and the West more broadly concerned.
Okay, so in terms of the funding, I mean, $1 billion project is a lot. What are the terms of where the funding is going to go, and how much of a difference this is going to actually make to the supply of critical minerals to the US?
It's an interesting point. A lot of these projects actually aren't up and running yet. They're not even, they're not commissioned. They're not producing anything. In fact, a lot of them are what we term shovel ready. So they're ready to be built, but they're going to take 26 months, 2 years, 3 years to build. The funds will go to these companies in helping them construct or take them down the next step of the road, whether that be more feasibility studies or actually building these projects. In the grand scheme of things, just how far does $2 billion go in shoring up the US's domestic supply of critical minerals? Well, it's a little bit unclear. What we do know is that critical minerals projects, so rare earths, lithium, that sort of stuff, they are really high capex. So we spend a lot of money. It's not like iron ore. It's not like coal where you can just dig up rock and process it. This requires a lot of chemistry, a lot of engineering skill. So yes, a lot more capital intensity. They do cost billions of dollars in themselves. So at $2 billion, just how many projects will get over the line, it really remains to be seen.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.